welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Welcome to MessianTics Podcast. We're going to be discussing some modern events that are going on right now around us in this episode. Two different events, but we want to try to discuss them from a different point of view than maybe other people have done so, and not focus in so much, at least on one of the events, but focus in on the hypocrisy or the response or the way believers have responded and are responding to these events. So the first one we're going to talk about is the opening ceremony at the Olympics, and then later in the episode, we're going to be talking about some events going on in and around Israel with the two assassination attempts, the rockets fired into Israel in the north, which took out 12 or 13 Druze children in a soccer field, and all the things and ramifications that are dealing with the expanding possibility of war in the region. So we want to talk about both of those things, so we hope that you'll listen through the entire episode so that you hear both of those things being participated with. So the first thing I want to talk about is this opening ceremony at the Olympics, and not so much about the ceremony or what took place, but about the inconsistent response of the believing community in response to that event. Now, understand that the Olympics is not a faith-based organization. It's not supposed to be a Christian or a Jewish or a Muslim event. It's a event based upon something that began in the Greco-Roman world, which was
Greek specifically.
Right, Greek specifically, which was designed to alleviate war. We were going to have battles of athletics rather than battles of war, to try to bring some kind of unity and fellowship between nations and such, and has gone on through the years in somewhat that direction throughout. Now, in saying that, I don't think any of the four of us thought that the display that went on at the opening ceremony should have been a display, not necessarily because of the blending of the Bacchus and the Last Supper part, but also because it was just not made for family-friendly viewing. It was a bizarre blend of things that the Olympics is supposed to be something you can sit down with your family together and watch going on, and this was way outside the scope of what I would consider something I would sit down with my children or grandchildren to celebrate. But the response to it has been interesting to me, because a large part of the response is Christians who were offended at the portrayal of the blending of Bacchus and the Last Supper, based on the Da Vinci portrait of the Last Supper, which is inconsistent with biblical narrative and biblical things in and of itself. So we're complaining that people blended things that weren't biblical with things that were biblical after a model of something that wasn't biblical to begin with when it was made by Da Vinci in his painting. And so just to bring out a couple of things to give that understanding is, one, there was leavened bread on the Passover table of Da Vinci's portrait. If you look in the back of the portrait, you see the sun shining. The Passover Seder or the Last Supper happened at night, not during the daytime. All of the participants in the Seder are sitting on chairs rather than reclining on pillows. And that's just three of the many things that were unbiblical about this portrayal made by Da Vinci of Yeshua or Jesus' Last Supper, which was a Passover Seder, not just a meal. And what interests me is that many of the people complaining that the Olympic people made a mockery of this Last Supper, which was a Passover Seder meal, don't participate in the actual Passover Seder meal themselves. In other words, Yeshua said, as oft as you do this in remembrance of me, talking about celebrating and observing the Passover. the Passover largely within the Christian world has been diminished and replaced by a communion meal, which is a later put together of parts of things that were earlier with a Catholic understanding, which ultimately became teaching of transubstantiation and a crucifixion of Yeshua every time you participate in the meal, which is a blending of later Catholic ritual with Jewish ritual to come up with this amalgamated thing called communion, which is exactly what they're complaining about the Olympics doing with the celebration of Bacchus and the Last Supper, this blending of rituals and beliefs into an amalgamation or a combined thing. So there's that part of it, that many of the Christians who are complaining about this mockery of the Last Supper or the last Seder meal Yeshua had with his disciples don't participate in the actual meal to begin with, and participate in something that was a replacement of that meal in their own faith. Regardless of right, wrong, or indifferent in doing communion, it is something different from the Passover Seder that Yeshua and his disciples participated in. And then when we go beyond that, we see that Christians today largely blend their major festivals or holidays with worldly things. For instance, again, the celebration of the birth of Messiah on Christmas, blended with Santa Claus, blended with Christmas trees, blended with lights, blended with other things that, right, wrong, or indifferent, having those things, they are outside of the story of the birth of the Messiah. And then when we have Easter, which is called the celebration of the resurrection of Messiah, the death, burial, and resurrection of Messiah, blended in churches is Easter bunnies, Easter egg hunts, Easter things that are, again, a blending of things from the world with things from the Bible, in the same way that this Olympic thing was a blending of things from the world and things from the Bible. So I think we can have a discussion about the inconsistency and maybe even hypocrisy of believers getting angry about what happened at the Olympics while not being upset at all about doing the same thing. Matter of fact, I think we should be more offended by it happening among people who claim to be Bible believers within the scope of an exhibition of their faith than we should be offended by people who aren't believers at all, who don't proclaim God at all, doing something outside of that.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue here is, at least in my perspective, is I think we have a terrible tendency as followers of Messiah to expect the world to act like believers. To act like they actually believe in the Bible, that they live by the Bible, that, you know, what have you. Now, and look, I'll be perfectly honest. If they had done the exact same thing while blending with some imagery of Islam or Muhammad or something along those lines, the reaction would be far different from the supporters of Islam. I mean, that's just the bottom line of it. It would have been an entirely different reaction. It would have been, for lack of a better way of wording it, it would have been terrifying. But the reality is that we can't expect non-believers to act like believers. And the guy that designed this whole presentation, this whole program, is very adamantly not a believer, very adamantly opposed to what, as Bible-believing followers of Yeshua, what we actually hold to as being important and dear and moral and biblical in scope and so on. So to expect that of believers, while at the same time, to be perfectly honest, especially in consideration of the idea of the hypocrisy of complaining about the blending of things, the reality is most believers don't generally act like believers either. As terrible as, I mean, just look at the countless scandals, sexual scandals and stuff that are plaguing the body of Messiah, even as we speak. I mean, we go back to the decades upon decades, which is probably way more than that. We just don't know about it. But the decades upon decades of child sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, to the number of major megachurch pastors and such that have been busted in sexual affairs outside of their marriage, or in
what was the website?
The Ashley Madison scandal. I haven't watched it because there's stuff I don't want to see, but there's a whole documentary about it on one of the streaming services. But the Ashley Madison scandal, where you subscribe to this website and put your information in there to find other people that wanted to cheat on their spouses, that you didn't have to go to the coffee shop to do it, or a bar or whatever. You could do it all quiet and whatever. And then when
website for cheating.
Exactly. when there was a hack on it and all the information was leaked out on the web, an overwhelming number of the people who were signed up and actively using it were pastors, or like there was a number of people from Family Research Council, who is a huge lobbyist organization that are supposed to be pro-family, pro-Bible. They're anti-same-sex relationships, they're anti-homosexuality, they're anti-all this. And there were a number of their leadership and Family Research Council that were busted in the Ashley Madison scandal, plus a bunch of other pastors and so on. So while the body of Messiah is getting all uptight because a group of non-believers weren't acting like believers, the reality is believers don't often act like believers also. So maybe we should look in the mirror. What is it? Rabbi Toby says this a lot. What is it Yeshua talks about? Take the plank out of your eye before pointing the speck in somebody else's.
Right.
And we just got to get over ourselves. And I think there's a far bigger issue, and this leads to something we're going to talk about later too, but I think there's far more to be upset about in the fact that there are pro-Hamas protests happening at the athletic events that Israel's athletes are participating in, and nobody's doing anything about it. They are protesting in favor of a recognized terrorist organization, and there have been actual threats levied to that there were people that were wanting to reenact the Munich Games slaughter of the Israeli athletes at this Olympic Games, and yet there's no outcry about that. There's no outcry about the protests that are going on. There's no, but yet we're upset about a painting.
We should be, as believers, much more upset that the Israeli athletes were told they couldn't wear the yellow ribbon in remembrance of the hostages, while the Palestinian and others were able to wear shirts showing planes dropping on kids. And missiles dropping on kids and things.
On kids playing on a playground or a soccer field, whatever it was. And then within days of that actually happens as Hezbollah launches a rocket and hits a playground in a Druze village. And what was it, 12 kids that were killed because of it? The Israeli Druze kids. Like, these aren't Jewish kids that are Israeli. These are Arab Druze who are Israeli, who are pro-Israel, supportive of Israel, Israeli citizens. By the way, apartheid state, quote unquote. There are Arabs who are citizens in Israel. Great apartheid. We're not very good at it. You notice that we keep using that accusation. We're not good at it, though.
Yeah, Israel is the worst genocide government in the world because their enemies keep growing under their leadership and government, rather than being wiped out. So, but all of these things, these are inconsistencies that as believers, we should be much more concerned about what's happening to the Israeli athletes in Paris than we are what's happened in this demonstration by people who were not believers. Their whole purpose was to demonstrate that they were not people of biblical faith, but connected with the Greco worldview of hedonism and debauchery.
Which is at the base of the Olympics to begin with.
Exactly.
Well, I think that if you're going to... I guess it doesn't surprise me when the church writ large... There's a lot of the church that supports Israel, but there's a lot of the church that's, I wouldn't say against it, but I'm sure there is some people that, but in general, I think that the issue is a lot of the churches, too much of the church, I will say, I don't have numbers or anything, but they're just ambivalent about Israel, and I think that's a theological issue with the Christian church, because the Christian church largely believes in a pre-tribulation rapture theology in the church. And basically what the pre-tribulation rapture says is, well, before it gets bad, Christians are going to be sucked up and out of there anyway, So sometimes I think that that's a lot of the reason why there is this whole idea of, just being ambivalent about things going bad for Israel. And that's just one theological issue. There's a lot of theological issues. There's the issue of there are some Christians that believe the rapture is going to happen, and there's going to be the quote, the time of Jacob's trouble, and the Jews are going to go, they're going to get saved, but they got to go through something else. And so, there's that. And so I've run into Christians that support Israel, and I've run into Christians that are not like Israel, but they just look at Israel like it's any other country, because in their mind, what Christianity did and what Yeshua did, was, the Jews were God's chosen people, but now it's this, this different situation where there's Jews and Gentiles, and we're all God's people, and we're all over the world. And so there becomes this focus on the whole world, and Israel is just one of those nations, just one of those people, and they're just a people God used to bring salvation. And yes, God loves every people equally, but He makes the Scripture is very clear that the central location prophetically of where things happen in the Bible and where they hinge is in Israel. And with the salvation of the Jewish people being a major linchpin in the rest of the world, like what God says in Isaiah, He goes, it's too trifling of a thing just to save Israel. He goes, you're going to go to the world. But at the same time, God remains speaking about Israel the rest of the time, and how the nations would come to her. I don't understand that. These are things that God's saying will happen. And so it does boggle my mind that even Christians don't focus on Israel as something central. You don't have to be Messianic to do that. You can just read the Bible. The problem is that, again, I look at this as I'm not trying to pull away from the issue that Christians have their own issues. I just think as far as culturally, I'm just talking like theologically. When I was a Baptist as a kid in Sunday school, you began, if you started reading the Bible, you're supposed to start in John. As opposed to Genesis, where some of the most, where I think the reason why you should start in Genesis is because you need to see what God originally intended to know what He's trying to get back to, which is the Garden of Eden, right? But, so there is that ambivalence. So I hope I explained that. But then there's just, to look at some other examples. There was one recently a few months ago. I think it was over spring. It was this whole, again, you're talking about, Christians or the church behaving like the world. I look at this a few months ago, that whole scandal with Mark Driscoll and the Stronger Men's Conference, where they go to this conference and it's explosions and it's monster trucks and it's people dancing seductively, which is a problem. It's a problem. I don't understand what a monster truck flying over exploding cars is telling me about the Lord and how that's bringing me closer to Him.
I mean, not that I'm opposed to going to a monster truck show.
Right, but it's not as a worship experience.
I know what he's getting at. I'm just...
No, I just go back to...
But that's a perfect example of what we're talking about. Within the church itself, they had this men's worship experience that brought in... was it flame eaters?
Pole dancer.
Pole dancers.
It was a male pole dancer. He was from
and monster
Vegas.
trucks and fireworks. All this stuff that is world stuff brought in to try to blend worldliness with godliness to bring about an interest in men in things of God. This is exactly what the Olympics did. Only it's being done inside the body of believers, and then looking outside and saying, you guys shouldn't do this, when we're doing exactly the same thing.
But the problem with the men's conference is you had problem number one, which was the conference itself. Mm-hmm. John Lindell was the pastor, and so then Mark Driscoll gets up there and he, publicly rebukes the whole thing and talks about a spirit of Jezebel, which once again... That's a term that's thrown around when spirit of Jezebel. Right, but the spirit of Jezebel is it's not a myth. The Bible doesn't say anything about the spirit of Jezebel. It has a lot to say about Jezebel, and I think that's something we can learn from. But the whole pointing at something of spirit. So the church has its own issues to contend with, but the whole idea that to get mad at the world for being the world. Paul is very specific about that, about how that's a waste of time. Not that the world, it's not that you shouldn't waste your time to minister to the world and to share the gospel with the world, but to get upset because they're the world is a waste of time, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Right, which goes back to the verse, that's often quoted out of context and misused, that judge not that ye be not judged, for by how you judge, you will be judged. This is an exact example of people doing exactly the same thing they're judging other people for. Judging the other people, but not dealing with the actual sin in the camp.
Yeah, and that's what Yeshua did when he walked the earth, and it's a good point. So you have to read Yeshua's pattern of ministry. He never railed against the world. He didn't rail against Rome.
Yeah.
He always railed against his own family, which was his people, the Pharisees. This wasn't, he didn't hate the Pharisees. He loved them, and he pleaded with them. He's like, you don't see it, it's right in front of you, But he began in God's household. And he stayed in God's household the entirety of his ministry,
Yeah, this was a perfect opportunity for the body of Messiah to look at what happened and use it as a teaching point, rather than complaining, railing, making accusations of hatred and anti-Christian action and all that, which it all probably was, all of those things. But to use it and say, look, we need to go back to our foundation. We need to go back to that table that Yeshua sat at with his disciples. We need to go back to the Passover. We need to understand our redemption comes from the sacrifice of a lamb, and that blood of the lamb being put on that we need to go back to the fact that Yeshua said, this is my body and this is my blood, and go back to, this was a perfect example for us to say, here we see two pictures, one of the world, one of the godly, and we need to hold on to the godly and separate from the world.
We need to make sure we're doing, just using that as a symbolism, like we look at the world parodying and lampooning the Passover table, but we should look at ourselves and say, are we behaving at God's table correctly?
Right, or are we a parody of what it is?
Because once again, pointing to the book of Revelation, the first few chapters, what is Yeshua doing? He's rebuking churches. And we miss that. And once again, one of the main things Yeshua said is like, why are you so surprised the world's making fun of you? That's what they did to me. They made fun, they rejected, and they, so.
Crucified me.
Right. And that's the point. I'm like, the hero of your faith died, right? He died. He gave up his agency, And then when we see the Olympics and wicked people in power with money and stuff, and they're making fun of God, I think, like Rabbi Eric said, it's actually not a time to attack them. We need to be introspective, and we need to make sure, do we need to repent?
Right. We need to make sure that the body of Messiah isn't presenting itself as the parody that the Paris Olympics presented the Last Supper as, a blend of Bacchus and the Last Supper, a blend of worldliness and ungodliness and debauchery and all of those things. Or are we what we're supposed to be, which is disciples?
Also, to that end, it's important, and this is something that I had somebody get upset with us at CMC a while back because they said I don't preach about politics enough, and I don't preach against ESPN and Disney and all of this and what have you. And this is credit to my wife, Danielle, that said this. She goes, look, if we spend all of our time talking about what we're against, when is anybody ever going to hear what we're for? Yeah. And that's kind of been, I had never thought about it that way, but that has always kind of been my approach to ministry, is I would rather get somebody to Messiah and then let Messiah work out the mess in their life than to, I think we have this notion that, and I think this whole discussion kind of proves it. We have this notion that people need to get their lives right first, and then they can come to God. And God says, no, you're not going to get your life right on your own. Come to me, and then let me take care of the rest. Let me handle the rest. The problem is there's so many believers, and I want to make this statement very clear, and I know we're like 25 minutes in this episode when this is finally being said. we've talked a lot about the church and so on. This is a body of Messiah issue. This is not to say Messianic Judaism is better or has done better or gets it all right all the time or anything like that, right? We're not saying that at all. But this is a body of Messiah issue through and through. We are so focused, and I think it's because there's an overwhelming blend of politics and the gospel. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have political opinions and so on. Like, we need to have stances. We need to have things we stand. We need to have things that we stand for, and they should be in alignment with what the Bible actually stands for, right? But I think for far too many in the body of Messiah, we are so hyper fixated on the political legislative side that we forget about the actual work of the gospel side. It drives me nuts when I see people try to legislate biblical morality. And this goes back to what we're talking about. We can't expect believers or non-believers to act like believers, but we're happy to try and legislate biblical morality so that we don't actually have to do what the Bible tells us to do, right? The conservative side of the body of Messiah is so anti things like welfare and so on and so forth. But at the same time, our congregations as a whole don't do what we're supposed to do to take care of the needy, the poor, the orphaned, and widowed, and so on. And so we're like, hey, government, you do this because we don't want to, but at the same time, don't do this because that's our money too. But the gospel specifically tells us. Now imagine how much different and we'll just look at this in the West with America. Imagine how much different the world around us in America would look at the body of Messiah if our congregations put the money where our mouths are. If we actually started to, and some do, like I know Bradam's really good about it. We try our best to give in to the things like this, and there are a lot of congregations that do. But as a whole, it is not something that's regularly done. Imagine if we actually stopped waiting on the government to do what we think is their job, but instead realize it's actually our job and start doing that, right? But we're so hyper-fixated on trying to legislate or politic morality that we just straight up ignore the fact that the only way that people's moral compass gets changed is when they encounter God, and they're supposed to be able to do that with the people of God. We're supposed to help people encounter God, to help people find Messiah so that their life changes, their moral compass is swapped around and pointing in the right direction and so on. But we're so busy about telling people what we hate about their lives that we don't actually tell them that there's somebody that loves them despite their failures. Right? There's somebody that loves them that literally gave all. You know, you guys talked about he was hung on the cross for this, right? He literally gave all to redeem the least of us, right? And so what if we changed our messaging? What if we actually talked about what God wants to do and has done for you rather than what we think you should do for God? And let them get to God, and then from there, what if, God forbid, what if we as believers actually modeled the work of the gospel in our life? So that people looked at us and went, oh, so Westboro Baptist isn't what, this is what it's supposed to look like. But Westboro Baptist is the biggest mouth, and that's the ones and everybody goes, oh, they're just like them. No, we're not.
Well, it's like being in a bar, you know. Who's the loudest person in the bar? The drunk guy in the corner yelling.
It's usually the Navy guys.
Yeah. But yeah, I've seen some Army and Marines too.
I only say that because Rabbi Eric is in the Navy, and it's just fun to mess with him.
But you know, and there is a lot of drunkenness on politics and drunkenness on just conservatism in general, which is not the gospel, never will be. And there's
it more borders on fear mongering than anything.
Yeah, it's a scramble for power and control over the direction of the country, and it people. You know, conservatives wonder, like, why do moderates like not really care for the conservative position? It's like, it's because your behavior is so atrocious. Your words are, you know, constantly fighting, you know, against people who you could be allying with. You know, you read, I've been reading more about, you know, the early period of, as the world is identifying believers, particularly through the Roman Empire, very early on, like in the first, you know, 200s. Had no political power, was woefully persecuted, both formally by the local governorships of Rome, and of course just in general, socially. And the gospel spreads because these are the people who are willing to actually care for folks. You know, a plague hits a town, who comes in and actually sits with the sick and the dying and aids them to the end of dying themselves eventually of the sickness. It's believers. It's those people, and that's what really they not complaining about the emperor. Not complaining about the senator of that region, the local magistrate, but actually going and being willing to die even for their behalf, even if they don't ever join your side or become someone who's willing to defend you in your position. And that's where this whole thing with the Olympics thing is, because if we've all been paying attention to social media and the news at all for the last year, it's just one more peg and a long ladder of rungs of things and events that have happened where we have this outlandish response from believers, whether Christian, Messianic, and it's like, and I've gotten to the point where I begin to ask, like, what are we known for? Are we known for this? Is this going to be the legacy of the last 50 years of, faith-based organizations? Of that we got mad about everything that happened in the world, or did we go sit and die on behalf of the people who did those things?
Yeah, and as we get ready to change kind of conversation to talk about the second half of what we said we were going to talk about, which is what's going on in Israel, I just want to point out that of all the things that these people who are ungodly and unrighteous and they don't believe in God, they're atheistic, all that, of all the things they could have put up in front of people, they chose the Last Supper. So even in their attempt to belittle the world, they're still presenting a portion of the Bible, a portion of what we believe. It's like if you don't believe in God, why fight against Him? If you don't believe in God, why put it up there at all? So what's amazing to me is, of all the people all around the world that could start a conversation about the Passover, about the death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua, about this event that took place at that table where He said, "This is my body and this is my blood," about all that, about the betrayal of Yeshua, and about all the things that go on, including the worship experience and all that, of all the people who could put that in front of the world, these folks in France put it up in front of the whole world and brought everybody's attention to that event. And what an opportunity it was for us of faith who believe in Yeshua to use that as a springboard to the good news, instead of this venom and reaction that we had to ungodly people. And again, none of us are saying we appreciated in any way the presentation that took place, nor was it godly, nor should it have been there, nor should it have been done from our opinion. However, when we think about it, how many of us had the opportunity to present that picture, to bring it to mind of people, to raise the awareness, to think about that was done that night? And did we miss an opportunity to turn what was intended for evil into good? Did we miss an opportunity to take what was intended to mock God and show the love, mercy, and grace of God to the whole world while they were watching? While the whole world was watching, we had an opportunity to say, okay, this was their presentation, but let me tell you about what really happened. Let me tell you about what really took place at that table. What about if every church in the world and every synagogue, Messianic synagogue in the world, took this week to talk about the Passover, to talk about redemption, to talk about the Exodus, to talk about the actual presentation of what took place at that Seder, instead of using it as a means to rail against the world again? Instead of sharing the bad news, what do you think would happen if we actually started sharing the good news?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's my thought. And again, not validating anything that went on. It was atrocious. It was horrible. Our children shouldn't have been exposed to it. Our wives shouldn't have been exposed. Our husbands. Nobody should have seen what went on.
I wouldn't want to have exposed my husband to that, yeah.
Yeah, you should not expose your husband to that. But of all of those things, we missed, I think, an opportunity to say even the ungodly are thinking about the godly, and let's start from there and show why Messiah came to the world. And remember that Messiah came to a Greco-Roman world to show the redemption of the Passover, which was exactly what was shown this week. So Rabbi David, why don't you jump us into the conversation about what's going on in Israel, and we'll go from there.
So hopefully our audience keeps up with kind of what's happening in the current Israel, Hamas-Israel, Arab as a whole conflict as it continues to grow. And this is kind of a nod to something Rabbi Toby mentioned earlier as well, which is that all of biblical prophecy, and especially all of end-time prophecy, hinges on Israel and the Middle East. Like, I know American believers, we love to think that the great old U.S. of A. is God's favorite and the new Zion and whatever kind of a concept, right? But unfortunately, I've never once seen the U.S. of A. in end-time prophecy. What that means, I don't know, but I haven't seen it there. But the reality is that the all of biblical prophecy, and especially end-time prophecy, hinges on Israel and the Middle East. And so when we see, for instance, Matthew 24, Luke 21, wars and rumors of wars, and so on and so forth, it doesn't matter what we're seeing or hearing in the North American region, or what we're seeing or hearing in Eastern Europe, or those things matter. Every life lost is something to mourn for. But when it matters in terms of prophetic purposes is Israel and the Middle East. And obviously, since October 7th of last year, Israel has been in a constant war, which is now at least a two-front war, and growing from there, unfortunately. But as of yesterday, and as of the moment, there's no official details on who did what, where, and how, but we do know that, and by the way, we're recording this on July 31st, so as of yesterday, we mean July 29th,
July 30th.
July 30th, I'm sorry, and this episode will air on August 2nd, so when you start listening to this, it'll be August 2nd, so a few days from when these things occurred, but, and we should have more information at that point, but yesterday we know that in some missile attack by someone, that the leader of Hamas, the head guy of Hamas, which is Ismail Haniyeh, I believe is how it's pronounced, or somewhere around there, was killed by a missile strike in Tehran, Iran, which is the capital of Iran. So big thing there. No matter who's responsible for it, ultimately Iran is going to blame Israel. So that's something to keep an eye on. The fact that the head, the top leader of Hamas has now been taken out, which, by the way, he doesn't reside in Gaza. He hides in other countries and has minions do his bidding that he's willing to sacrifice because he doesn't care about them to begin with. But the head of Hamas getting taken out, what does this mean to Israel's ability to finish off Hamas in Gaza? We don't know. That's still there to see. We know historically vacuums get created when leaders are lost, and so there's bound to be some scumbag cockroach that's going to stand up and take his place or what have you, and that was a horrible way of wording that. Somebody's going to come for me on that, but somebody's going to step up in his place. But what does this mean in terms of Israel's current conflicts with Hamas? On top of that, the number 3 guy in Hezbollah, who is believed to be the one responsible for the planning of the rocket attack that hit the Druze village and killed the playground, the soccer field in Druze village, and killed a bunch of kids and injured a whole lot of people, innocent people, completely innocent people, was taken out in either Syria or Lebanon. I've seen mixed reports on that one, but either way, he was taken out by an attack there as well. Again, we'll know more information in the coming days as to who specifically is responsible for it or what have you. But either way it goes, whether Israel was responsible for it or not, Lebanon and Hamas are going to blame Israel, and they're going to come further into Golan and the northern area of Israel and create more problems. But what gets even scarier in terms of what's happening right now is that because of that, Turkey has now piped up and said that should Lebanon and Israel go into an all-out war over this, that Turkey will send troops into Lebanon to support Lebanon against Israel. Turkey is a NATO member nation, And so that creates a whole other layer of problems. Israel is a NATO ally, not an actual member nation, but an ally. So there's a lot of issues there. Obviously, U.S. is a NATO nation, and how that all plays into things. I mean, I don't know that I'm not international law expert by any means. I don't think Article 5 of NATO, if Turkey jumps in the mix without being attacked, I don't think it forces NATO membership to support them. But you never really know, and with the current political climate in the U.S., who really knows what's going to happen from us at the moment? But we do have added warships moving to the coast of Lebanon and so on. So the region is heating. If you thought the last 9 months hasn't been hot enough in the region, it's getting way worse as the day goes by. So, and that's just something, we've talked several episodes now on this current crisis. And I think for all of us, the main thing is we don't ever want this situation, as long as it's continuing, to fall to the wayside of the hearts and minds of believers, because we have an obligation biblically to support Israel. That doesn't mean we condone everything Israel does, and that doesn't mean that we like think that Israel is some sort of messianic figure in and of itself. But Israel is God's chosen people. The Jewish people is God's chosen people. The nation of Israel was restored according to prophecy. By the way, the same biblical prophecy that we cleave to about the return of Messiah, the reestablishment of the nation of Israel, is a prophetic precursor to the return of Messiah. So this was a prophetic piece of the puzzle. But as believers, we have an obligation to support Israel. We know prophetically that the entire world is going to turn their back on Israel. The entire world in one way or another is going to go to war with Israel. What that looks like, I don't know, and I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're on the doorstep. And so we just wanted to take a few moments to kind of process together everything that's happening right now. And I brought up some of this earlier because it ties directly into what's happening at the Olympic Games with the protests against Israel and for Hamas and so on and so forth, and everything that's happening. And I want it to be known, these protests are not in support of the Palestinian people, despite what people like to say. It's in support of Hamas, which is an internationally recognized terrorist organization. If they supported the Palestinian people, they would be pushing to get rid of Hamas. But instead, they're supporting Hamas. They're waving Hamas flags. They're all of this stuff it's absolutely atrocious. It's disgusting. The fact that there are believers involved in these protests is disgusting. And so we just wanted to take a few moments to kind of hit on this as a current event that's happening around us.
A couple of thoughts real quick. One is that people are waving Hamas flags around the world. If they were waving ISIS flags in the way that they're waving Hamas flags, people would be up in arms about it. But because it's Hamas against Israel, where ISIS was a terrorist group that was supposedly against the United States or whatever, they look at it different. When Hamas and ISIS are the same type of terrorist organization, they're Islamic terrorists going out. The second thing I wanted to say is that in the recent rocket attack in Israel that hit the Druze village and killed these children, people forget, and Rabbi David mentioned this a little earlier, that Israel is made up of Jews, Arabs, and Christians, and Druze, and people with no religion at all. It is not a monolith of Jewish people, and especially in the north, if you go up on the north of Israel by the Golan, a large part of it is Druze Arabs that live there, because the Golan used to be at one time part of Syria, and the Druze lived in that area. And when the new lines were drawn, the Druze within Israel became Israeli citizens. And they're Arabs. They are not Jews. And these are Arabs that were killed by other Arabs. Now, understand that's not unique, because just recently we knew when Syria was in its civil war that it was Arabs killing Arabs. It was Muslims killing Muslims. We saw Iraq and Iran in war, Muslims killing Muslims. We see this is all over the place, Muslims killing Muslims. So it's not a unique thing that Muslims would kill Muslims. What's unique is that this attack was against Israel, and it hit Druze Arabs there, and suddenly the world is looking at this attack just a little different than it did when the Muslims were just shooting rockets at Jews. Now they're shooting rockets not just at Jews, but at Arabs also, and somehow one life in Israel is different than another life in Israel, and the world reacts differently. So that's what's happening there. As a result, Israel took out, in defense of Arabs, Israel took out the Hezbollah leader who was in charge of and designed this rocket attack at Israel. Or we think Israel did.
And in defense of these Druze Arabs, because these Druze Arabs are citizens of Israel.
Right.
And despite what the mass media wants to say, Israel's concern is their citizenry, not just the Jewish people.
Exactly.
Their citizenry. The IDF, Knesset, every aspect of society in Israel consists of Jews, Christians, Arabs, Baha'is, everybody. They're all in there. They're all mixed in. Most of Israeli society is secular. And so on. It's mind-blowing the way people are responding to this.
Yeah, and we have to remember, and people don't know this, that the Knesset of Israel has Arab Muslim members.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court of Israel has Arab Muslim members. This is not an apartheid.
As does the IDF.
Right.
And we're talking high-ranking military officials in the IDF.
Right. Are Arab Muslims in the Israeli police force, Arab Muslims. This is not a society that separates Arabs from Israeli citizens. It is a society that separates terrorists from Israeli citizens and expects that if you're going to be a citizen, then you accept that your nation has a right to exist.
Yeah. And in the mix of this conversation, keep in mind that earlier this week, we also had, and I believe it was still earlier this week and not, it may have been late last week, but either way, we just had Benjamin Netanyahu, who spoke in front of Congress in the U.S. About what's been happening in Israel over the last 9 months. And in that, he even had multiple IDF personnel that were there with him who have been injured in this war. One of them was a Jewish guy. One of them was an Arab Israeli. One of them was a Bedouin. And then there was a fourth guy that was not in uniform that he didn't realize it was there, and I forget. I don't think he was Jewish either. And then in the midst of his speech, you've got Rashida Tlaib, who's waving a Palestinian flag and holding up a sign saying that Netanyahu's a war criminal and yada, 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 and all this. And you've got the crowd. There's a protest crowd there. You've got the monument in Washington that are being
defaced.
Yeah, and in Philly that are being defaced with swastikas and pro-Hamas symbols and all this kind of stuff. It's absolutely mind-blowing that this is happening in the U.S., and it's happening at our federal level. It's insane.
Right, and now we have also the assassination of these two, one Hezbollah and one Hamas leader, that is riling up the Arab nations against Israel. And our country, our Joint Chief of Staff said, if Israel gets attacked by Iran, we're going to protect Israel. But at the same time, our government is slow-walking weaponry to Israel because they're trying to pressure Israel to make a deal with Hamas to a ceasefire and allow Hamas to reconstitute in Gaza.
Yeah. And keep in mind, there are still 120-something hostages. There were 131, I think was the last number I heard, but I know that at least one or two have been confirmed to have died recently. But there's over 125 or so hostages still unaccounted for.
Right.
And about 40
several of them are American.
Yeah. And about 40 of them, I think, Hamas has specifically said are dead.
Right.
So just so you're aware, there are still innocent hostages being held for 9 months by Hamas, and they're also still coming into Israel and taking hostages. That's the thing people aren't talking about. There have been more people kidnapped that are hostages that have been taken on both sides, the north and the south.
And without getting too political, the first action of Kamala Harris after she became the Democratic candidate, or the presumed Democratic candidate, was to boycott Netanyahu's talk to Congress And then her first speech was one in support of the Gazans in this thing. So which was responded to by Hezbollah and Hamas, which leads us in this cycle to elevate, which brings us to the assassinations, if Israel did it, of these two leaders.
Yeah, and a big part of that is because she knows she has no shot at winning if she doesn't have, Tlaib and all of those whack jobs on her side.
So all of this is stirring up right now. So, when we think about this whole biblical war, this prophetic event is going on in Israel and around Israel, and a lot of people are looking at Paris and this, instead of having their minds on what's going on prophetically in Israel and around Israel, are focused on this distraction.
Yep, I was sitting, I think it was last night, I was sitting looking at some articles about the Hezbollah, the number 3 from Hezbollah getting killed, and Rabbi Toby texts me and goes, holy crap, the leader of Hamas was just killed in Tehran. And I'm like, wait, what? I've missed something. And I'm searching, and sure enough, the media, the social media was going nuts with information about it and what have you. But it's been a pretty crazy week or so in dealing with what's happening in Israel. All right, well, with that, guys, we appreciate your time. We pray that this episode is a blessing to you, and we will see you guys next time. Please let us know your thoughts, and continue to send your questions in as we continue to interact with the various questions that come in through our listener submissions on episodes progressing.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.